The man was sitting across from me at a table I had bought in a room I had renovated with my own savings, inside a building with my name on the deed. He had a folder in front of him. He had a number written on a piece of paper, and he slid that paper across the table toward me like he was doing me a favor. $80,000, that was his price. That was what he said my son's wedding would cost me if I wanted it to happen the way everyone had already planned. He said it with a straight face. He said it like he had all the power in the room, and I sat there and looked at him and thought about how long I had been quiet. I thought about every time I had made myself smaller so that other people could feel bigger. I thought about my son who deserved better than this moment, who had worked hard and fallen in love honestly and had no idea that the man who was about to become his father-in-law had decided that love had a fee. I did not say anything right away. I just looked at the paper. And then I looked at the man, and I let the silence do the work that the truth was about to finish. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something directly. If someone tried to put a price on one of the most important days of your child's life, and they had no idea that you were the one who held all the cards, what would you do with that power? Would you correct them immediately? Would you let them keep going until they had said everything they planned to say? Would you stay quiet just long enough to make sure there was no way out for them? Stay with Marcus Reid. Because the answer he chose changed everything, and it did not happen the way that man expected. Marcus Reid was 51 years old when the worst and most satisfying conversation of his adult life happened inside a room he owned on a street. He knew better than his own reflection in the mirror. He had built a lot in those 51 years, not in the way people brag about, not in the way that gets splashed across social media with motivational quotes and filtered pictures. He had built quietly the way his father had taught him: work first, then work again. Do not talk about what you are doing until it is done. Do not wait for applause. Do not explain yourself to people who are not paying your bills. His father had said those things at a kitchen table in a small house in a medium-sized city, and Marcus had carried those words the way some people carry photographs. Close, always there, taken out when things got hard. His son's name was Daniel. Daniel Reid was 28 years old, which meant that Marcus still remembered the exact weight of him the first time he held him in the hospital, and that memory had never gotten smaller no matter how many years passed. Daniel had his mother's eyes and Marcus's stubbornness, which was a combination that had made raising him both exhausting and deeply satisfying. Daniel worked in architecture. Not a famous firm, not a corner office, but honest work that he had earned through a real degree and real late nights and real effort. Marcus was proud of him in the quiet way that fathers sometimes carry pride like it is too heavy to say out loud. Daniel had been with his girlfriend, Priya Anand, for 3 years. She was warm, smart, and genuinely kind to Daniel in the ways that mattered most. She made him laugh. She pushed him to be better. She called Marcus on his birthday and remembered small details about his life that even some friends forgot. Marcus liked her. He liked her clearly and without reservation, which for a man who had learned to take his time trusting people was not a small thing. The problem was not Priya. The problem walked in wearing expensive shoes that had never seen a hard day, carrying an opinion about everything and a willingness to back it up with pressure. His name was Gerald Anand, Priya's father. He had made his money in commercial real estate in another city, and he had brought with him the specific kind of confidence that money sometimes produces in people who mistake net worth for character. He was not cruel in an obvious way. He was the kind of man who said difficult things with a pleasant expression and then watched to see what happened. He was the kind of man who always had a reason why things should go his way, and the reason always sounded almost logical until you examined it too carefully. Marcus had met Gerald 4 times before the conversation at the table: at a dinner at Daniel's apartment, at a holiday gathering at Priya's family home, at a birthday party, and at an informal engagement celebration that the families had put together at a restaurant 3 months after Daniel proposed. Each time Marcus had noticed things. Gerald spoke over people without realizing he was doing it or perhaps realizing it perfectly. Gerald made a point of mentioning what things cost. Gerald had a way of categorizing people by what they owned and what they had done with it, and Marcus had fee. The weight of that categorization in the way Gerald spoke to him. Polite, slightly too polite, the kind of polite that is actually a form of dismissal. Marcus had not said anything about it. He was a patient man. He had been patient his whole life, sometimes too patient, and he had made peace with the fact that patience was both his greatest strength and the thing that had cost him the most over the years. He had given the benefit of the doubt. He had told himself that Gerald was just a particular kind of personality, and that what mattered was Priya and Daniel and the life they were building. Then came the folder. The wedding was planned for the following October. Priya and Daniel had chosen a venue together, a beautiful historic building in the heart of the city that had been converted into an event space about 7 years ago. It had exposed brick walls and tall windows and a garden in the back that turned golden in the fall. It was one of the most sought-after event spaces in the area. People booked it 18 months in advance. The food was done by an in-house catering operation that had a reputation for doing things right. Marcus owned the building. He had bought it 11 years ago when it was half collapsed and everyone else thought it was a liability. He had spent 3 years and most of his savings restoring it. He had built the catering business from the ground up, hiring people he trusted, learning more about food and service than he had ever expected to learn. He had turned something broken into something people wanted. It was his, all of it, the deed, the business license, the name on the invoice. Daniel knew this, of course. Daniel had helped him paint walls during the renovation. Daniel had loaded chairs and tables in the early days when they were setting up for events. The venue being chosen for the wedding was not a random coincidence. It was a kind of quiet tribute, a full circle that Marcus had felt in his chest when Daniel and Priya told him they wanted that space. He had given them a family rate that was more than fair. He had arranged everything carefully and made sure the event team was briefed on every detail. What Daniel did not know, and what Marcus had not yet corrected, was that Priya's father had never been told who owned the venue. Priya knew. She had been told when they booked the space. But somewhere between the booking and the months of planning that followed, Gerald had either not been informed or had not retained the information. And Marcus, who tended to let things unfold naturally rather than announcing himself, had not gone out of his way to explain his ownership to a man he was still evaluating. That decision, which Marcus had made without much deliberation, turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Gerald called Marcus 3 weeks before the wedding. He said he needed to meet. He said there were some financial matters related to the event that needed to be addressed face to face. Marcus agreed. He suggested the venue itself, which had a private meeting room off the main hall. Gerald agreed without hesitation because why would the location mean anything to him? Marcus arrived early. He made himself coffee in the kitchen he had designed. He sat in the room he had furnished and looked out the window he had replaced and waited. Gerald arrived 14 minutes late, which Marcus noted but did not mention. Gerald was dressed well, carrying a leather portfolio, and wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. He shook Marcus's hand firmly and sat down across the table without looking at the room around him the way a guest might. He looked at it the way a man looks at a setting he has chosen for an important performance. He opened the portfolio. He laid out papers. He spoke with the careful deliberateness of someone who had organized their argument. What he said in summary was this. The wedding was going to be expensive. Priya's family had expectations for how the wedding should look and feel. Gerald had done research on what weddings of this kind typically cost. He had numbers from vendors and estimates from event planners he had consulted. He had decided that Marcus needed to contribute $80,000 to the wedding budget, in addition to whatever family rate he had arranged through the venue. This was not a suggestion. Gerald used the word contribution, but the way he said it made clear that refusal was not a real option. He said that Priya deserved a certain kind of celebration. He said that a man in Marcus's position should understand what a proper wedding costs. He said that if the financial alignment could not be reached, then it might be necessary to reconsider the timeline of the wedding altogether. Reconsider the timeline, that was the phrase he used. But what he meant was that he would delay or threaten to cancel the wedding if Marcus did not produce $80,000. Marcus looked at paper Gerald had slid across the table. He looked at the number. He looked at Gerald's face, which was calm and certain, the face of a man who had never been told no by someone he had underestimated. And Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked one question. He asked, calmly and without any edge in his voice, whether Gerald knew who owned the venue they were currently sitting in. Gerald's expression shifted slightly. He said he assumed it was a company, a management company, something corporate. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he reached into his own folder, the one he had brought and placed on the table without making a point of it, and he took out a single document. It was a copy of the property deed. His name was on it clearly near the top of the first page. He placed it on the table in front of Gerald without saying anything. He let Gerald read it. He watched Gerald's face move through several things in quick succession. Confusion, recalibration, something close to embarrassment but not quite, because pride was fighting embarrassment for control. And then the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground under him is not what he thought. Gerald looked up. He said Marcus's name as if confirming he was still looking at the right person. Marcus said yes. Then Marcus explained, still calmly, that he also owned the catering company, that the invoice Gerald had been given for catering services had his company name on it, that the family rate Daniel and Priya had received was a personal decision Marcus had made, not a corporate discount, that the venue team working the event were his employees, that every arrangement that had been made for this wedding had been made through Marcus's own business, and that Marcus had given it all to them at a significant reduction because he loved his son and genuinely liked Priya. Gerald did not speak for a long time. Marcus did not fill the silence. He had learned over 5 decades of living that silence was one of the most powerful things a calm person could offer to a panicking one. Then Marcus did something Gerald had not expected. He told the truth about how he felt without anger, without raised voice, and without any performance of hurt. He said that he had spent 3 years being polite to a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that polite meant invisible. He said that he had watched Gerald speak over him at dinners and make assumptions about his worth, and categorize him as the less successful side of the family equation, without ever asking a single real question about who Marcus Reid was or what Marcus Reid had built. He said that he had chosen patience because the relationship between Priya and Daniel was real and worth protecting. He said that patience had been the right choice until a man pulled out a piece of paper and tried to put a price on his son's right to get married. He said all of this quietly. He said it the way a man speaks when he has already decided he is not going to raise his voice, because raising his voice would give the other person something to react to, and Marcus did not want Gerald to have any exits. Then Marcus told Gerald that the $80,000 demand was over, not refused. Over. He said that word carefully. He said that the conversation Gerald had planned to have was finished, and that what happened next would depend entirely on how Gerald chose to behave from this moment forward. He said that the wedding was still happening in October. He said that Priya and Daniel did not need to know about this conversation unless Gerald chose to make it necessary. He said that he had no interest in humiliating Gerald in front of his daughter or disrupting the relationship between two people who were genuinely in love. He said that what he did have interest in was respect, not applause, not gratitude, just basic human respect. The kind that does not require a man to list his assets before he is treated like a person. Gerald sat very still. Marcus stood up, he collected his document. He picked up his coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and he said one last thing before he walked toward the door. He said that the venue was fully booked for the October wedding date, that every vendor connected to the event was his, and that the event would be beautiful because Marcus took pride in his work. He said that Priya deserved a beautiful wedding. He said that Daniel deserved a father-in-law who understood what real value looked like. Then he said that he hoped, genuinely hoped, that today was the beginning of Gerald understanding something important. He left the room and closed the door behind him. He did not slam it. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, Gerald had called Priya. Marcus did not know the content of that call immediately. But Priya called Daniel, and Daniel called Marcus that evening with a voice that was tight in the way voices get when someone is trying to hold too difficult thigh. NGS at the same time. He asked Marcus what had happened at the meeting. Marcus told him all of it, calmly, the paper, the number, the conversation, the documents he had placed on the table, the things he had said and the way he had left. Daniel was quiet for longer than Marcus expected. Then he said that he had not known his grandfather's old saying about a man revealing himself under pressure was going to apply to his future father-in-law 3 weeks before his wedding. Marcus almost laughed. Then Daniel said that Priya was upset, which Marcus had expected, not at Marcus, at her father, which Marcus had hoped for but had not assumed. Priya called Marcus the next morning. She apologized. Not for her father exactly, because she said the apology needed to come from him, but for the fact that Marcus had been placed in that position inside a building he owned while doing everything right for everyone around him. She said she was embarrassed. Marcus told her she had nothing to be embarrassed about. He told her clearly that his feelings about her had not changed and that his commitment to giving her and Daniel a beautiful wedding had not changed either. She cried a little. He told her it was going to be fine. He meant it. Gerald did not call Marcus that weekend. He called on Monday. His voice was different. The careful deliberateness was still there, but the certainty was gone. He said that he had been thinking. He said that he might have approached the financial conversation in a way that was not appropriate. He said he had not fully understood the situation. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked Gerald a simple question. He asked whether Gerald believed that a man's worth was measured by how loudly he announced what he had or how quietly he built it. Gerald did not answer immediately. Marcus told him he did not need to answer out loud. He just needed to sit with the question. They agreed to meet again, this time at a restaurant that neither of them owned, on neutral ground without folders or papers or prepared numbers. Gerald arrived on time. He was dressed the same way he always dressed, but something in his posture was different. He was not performing this time. He was just sitting there as himself, which was a less polished and more honest version of the man Marcus had met before. They talked for almost 2 hours, not about money, about fathers and sons, about what men of their generation had been taught about providing and proving, about the specific loneliness of being a father who loves his daughter completely and then has to watch her build a life with someone from a family he does not yet understand. Gerald said things Marcus had not expected him to say. He did not say them perfectly. He said them the way real people say difficult things, which is with gaps and restarts and moments where the words do not come out exactly right, but the honesty was there. Marcus acknowledged it. He did not rush to forgive, and he did not perform forgiveness for the sake of comfort. But he acknowledged the honesty because ignoring honesty when it finally arrives is its own kind of cruelty. What Marcus understood by the end of that dinner was something he had suspected for a while. Gerald was a man who had spent so long using wealth as the primary language of value that he had forgotten there were other languages. He had looked at Marcus and seen a man with a family rate at a venue and a pleasant enough manner and no visible announcement of power, and he had put Marcus in a category. That category told him Marcus could be pressured. It told him that Marcus was the quieter side of the equation, the side that would accept terms if they were presented firmly enough. He had been completely wrong, and the cost of being wrong had been contained almost entirely by the fact that Marcus had chosen not to detonate the truth publicly. Marcus understood that this restraint was something Gerald would think about for a long time. The wedding preparations continued. Marcus threw himself back into the work with the same care and attention he always brought to events at his venue. He worked with his catering team on the menu. He personally reviewed the garden setup for the outdoor ceremony. He made sure the lighting in the main hall was warm and not harsh. He replaced 2 tables that had developed a slight wobble. He arranged for fresh flowers to be sourced from a supplier he had used for 7 years who he trusted completely. He did this not to make a point. He did it because it was his work, and he took his work seriously, and his son was getting married in his building, and that was a moment he wanted to be as close to perfect as he could make it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel and Marcus had dinner alone. It was at the same small Italian place they had been going to since Daniel was a teenager, a place with checkered tablecloths and bread that arrived without being asked for. Daniel was quiet. For the first part of the meal in the thoughtful way he had always been quiet when he was working something out. Then he said that he wanted Marcus to know something. He said that he had talked to Priya a lot about what had happened and about who his father was as a person, not as a businessman, but as a person. He said that Priya had told him things about her own father that helped him understand the pressure Gerald had been operating under, the specific pressure of a man who had decided that his success was his love language and that money was how he showed care. He said he understood more now about why Gerald had done what he did. He did not say that what Gerald did was acceptable. He just said that understanding had made it easier to hold without it poisoning everything. Then Daniel said something that stayed with Marcus for a long time after that dinner. He said that watching Marcus handle the situation the way he had, without cruelty, without drama, without any of the weapons he could have used, had taught him something about what it looked like to be strong. He said he had always known his father worked hard. He had always known his father built things. But he had not fully known until now what it looked like to have power and choose how to use it. He said he wanted to remember that. He said he thought it was the most important thing he had ever seen his father do. Marcus looked at his son across the checkered tablecloth and the bread basket and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that the only thing he had done was remember who he was when the pressure arrived. He said that was the work, not the building, not the business, not the money, just remembering who you are when someone tries to tell you who you are not. They ate the rest of dinner talking about other things. There were other people who found out about the Gerald conversation in the weeks that followed. Not because Marcus told them, because he did not. But Gerald had apparently spoken to his brother, who had spoken to someone at a family gathering, and the general shape of the story had begun to move through Priya's extended family the way information moves through extended families, which is to say imperfectly and in multiple directions at the same time. What most of them heard was that Gerald had gone to the wedding venue to negotiate with the bride's future father-in-law and had discovered mid-negotiation that the future father-in-law owned the venue. What they heard next was that instead of using this to humiliate Gerald or cancel the event or charge full price as a form of punishment, Marcus had continued with the family arrangement and given them the same beautiful event he had promised. This version of the story, which was accurate in its broad shape, created a kind of reaction among the people who heard it that Marcus had not anticipated. People reached out to him, not people he knew well, but cousins of Priya's and old friends of Gerald's family who had heard what happened and felt the need to say something. Most of what they said was a version of the same thing. They said they respected how he had handled it. They said they had never seen Gerald be on the receiving end of something like that without the situation turning ugly. They said they did not know Marcus well, but they were glad Daniel was his son. Marcus thanked each of them briefly and did not elaborate on the details. He did not add drama, he did not perform the story, he just said thank you and moved on because the story was not the point. The point was behind him, the point was October. October arrived the way Marcus had known it would, with the particular golden light that fell through the tall windows of the venue in the late afternoon and turned the exposed brick walls warm. The garden was set up with white chairs and an arch of seasonal flowers. The main hall was dressed in a way that was elegant without being cold, warm without being fussy. The catering team had been briefed and prepared and was ready. Marcus stood to the side and watched his son walk into the room wearing a suit that fit him perfectly and carrying the specific expression of a man who is walking toward the most important moment of his day and knows it. Priya came in wearing a dress that needed no description beyond the fact that when Daniel saw her, his face became the simplest and most complete thing Marcus had ever watched happen to another person. Gerald was there, he was well dressed and he was quiet. He looked at the room. At some point during the afternoon he found Marcus near the garden door and stood next to him without saying anything for a moment. Then he said that it was a beautiful space. Marcus said thank you. Gerald said he meant the word. Marcus said he knew. That was the entirety of the exchange, and it was enough. The ceremony was what a ceremony should be. Personal, honest, short enough that no one got restless, long enough that every word had room to lie. The two of them said things to each other that Marcus was not sure he would be able to accurately describe later because he was too busy feeling them. He was aware, during that part, of a fullness that he did not have an exact word for. Something between gratitude and satisfaction and grief in the best way, the grief that comes when you understand that a season of your life is completing itself beautifully. The reception was everything the catering team had worked for. The food was excellent, which Marcus noted with the professional satisfaction of a man who takes that kind of thing seriously. The tables were full. The speeches were real and occasionally funny and once genuinely moving. Daniel danced badly and with complete commitment, which was precisely what Marcus would have predicted. At some point in the evening, Priya found Marcus sitting at a corner table with a glass of sparkling water and a small plate of food he had barely touched because he had been too busy watching. She sat down next to him. She was still in her wedding dress. She had her shoes off. She looked at him directly and said that she wanted him to know that she understood everything her father had tried to do in that meeting room. She said she was sorry that Marcus had been put through that. She said she was proud that he was her father-in-law. She said that word with deliberateness, like she wanted it to land correctly. Father-in-law. She said she was going to spend a long time making sure he knew that. Marcus looked at her and thought about the first time he had met her at Daniel's apartment, how she had shaken his hand and looked him in the eye and asked him a real question about his work before the evening was 20 minutes old. He thought about how he had made a private note of that and had been watching for the truth of it ever since. He thought that the truth of it was sitting next to him in a wedding dress with her shoes off, telling him that she saw him. He said thank you, he said welcome to the family. He said it the way he meant it. The night ended the way good nights end, which is gradually and warmly with people not quite ready to leave. The last guests filtered out slowly. The catering team moved through their closing procedures. Marcus walked the garden and the hall one last time the way he always did after events, checking that everything was in order, making small notes to himself about what had worked and what could be better. He stood in the main hall when it was quiet and empty, chairs stacked and tables cleared, and the golden light of the early evening had been replaced by the cooler light of venue lamps. He looked at the brick walls. He thought about the state the building had been in when he first walked through it more than a decade ago. He thought about every hour he had put into it. He thought about doing all of that without knowing exactly what it would become, trusting that the work would build something worth having. He thought about Gerald Anand sitting across from him 3 weeks earlier, sliding a piece of paper with a number on it across a table in this same building, believing completely that Marcus Reid was the kind of man who could be moved by pressure. He did not feel anger about it anymore. Anger had never been the right response. The right response had always been clarity, and clarity once achieved was surprisingly comfortable to live inside. The things Marcus had learned, over 51 years of building and losing and starting again, and staying patient and sometimes being too patient and finally learning the difference between peace and submission, could not be written down in a list and given to someone. They had to be lived. They had to be earned at the cost of quiet years and swallowed truths and moments that stung precisely because they came from people who were supposed to understand him. But the other side of that was this room. This building, this day, this son, this daughter-in-law who had looked at him and used the word on purpose. Marcus turned off the hall lights on his way out. He locked the front door with his own key. He walked to his car on a street he had known for 11 years. He drove home with the windows slightly open because the October air was the kind of cold that felt good when it moved. He did not call anyone. He did not post anything. He did not replay the conversation with Gerald one more time. He just drove home, and the quiet in the car was the good kind. Now here is the part that people who heard the outline of this story sometimes missed when they thought about it. They focused on the moment at the table when Gerald realized he was sitting in Marcus's building. They thought that was the payoff, the look on Gerald's face, the documents, the power shift. And yes, that moment was satisfying in the way that moments of earned truth always are. But that was not the real ending of the story. The real ending was that Marcus had built something ill before anyone came along to underestimate him. He had not built it as a defense. He had not built it to protect himself from men like Gerald. He had built it because he believed in work and in patience and in the quiet accumulation of things that have value. The building existed because Marcus had chosen it before he knew it would matter in this specific way. The catering company existed because he had taken pride in it before anyone arrived to test him. The family rate existed because he loved his son before any of this happened. Gerald had tried to make himself powerful in a room. Marcus had already spent 11 years building the room. That was the difference, not the documents, not the revelation, not the look on Gerald's face. The difference was that Marcus had been doing the work the whole time without knowing it would one day matter in exactly this way, and he had done it well enough that when the moment came to simply sit still and let the truth speak, there was nothing left for him to do but let it. There is a specific kind of peace that arrives when you have built something real and someone walks into it not knowing it belongs to you. It is quiet. It has no performance in it. It just sits there, like the brick walls and the tall windows and the garden that goes golden in October. Marcus had felt that peace before. He felt it when the building was finished and he walked through it empty for the first time. He felt it when the first event was held there and he stood in the back and watched people fill the room he had made. He felt it when Daniel told him they had chosen this space for the wedding. He felt it when Gerald's face moved through its journey of recalibration above the property deed. He felt it on the drive home that October night. It was not a loud feeling. It never had been. That was the thing about building quietly. The reward when it arrived was also quiet, and that was exactly right. That was exactly the shape Marcus Reid had always wanted his life to take. Because the people who make the most noise while they are trying to assert their power are usually the ones who have the least of it to begin with. And the people who say the least while they are building something real are usually the ones who, when the moment comes, have the most room to simply be still. Gerald Anand had come to Marcus Reid's building with a folder and a number, and a plan to negotiate from a position of power. Marcus Reid had offered him coffee and waited. That is a story about more than one meeting in one room. It is a story about what it looks like when a life of honest work, honest building, and honest patience finally has somewhere to stand where it cannot be argued with. It is a story about what happens when a man who has spent years being seen as the quieter option turns out to have been the foundation the whole time. It is a story about a father who gave his son the best thing he had, not the building, not the business, the example. And it is a story about how sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is sit across from someone who is trying to diminish them, and simply not move. In the months after the wedding, Gerald and Marcus did not become close friends. That was not a realistic outcome, and Marcus had never been interested in performing reconciliation for the sake of appearances. What they became was something more honest than that. They became two men who understood each other more clearly than before, who had moved through a difficult moment without allowing it to collapse the things that mattered, and who could sit at the same table during holidays and speak to each other with the particular directness of people who no longer have anything to prove. Gerald stopped speaking over Marcus at dinner. It was not a dramatic change, it was gradual. But Marcus noticed it the first time it happened at a Christmas gathering 3 months after the wedding when Gerald asked Marcus a question about the history of the building and actually listened to the answer instead of waiting for a place to redirect the conversation. It was a small thing. Marcus did not make a note of it out loud. He just answered the question. But he filed it away in the way that patient people file small pieces of evidence. Not vindication, just information. Daniel and Priya settled into their life together with the ease of two people who had chosen each other correctly. They rented a good apartment in a neighborhood that suited them. They talked about buying something in a few years. They invited Marcus to dinner regularly. He went when he could and made sure not to hover when they needed space. He was learning in these later years of fatherhood that the work of being a good father did not stop when a child became an adult. It just changed shape. Less about presence and protection, more about being available without being in the way. Marcus continued to run the venue and the catering company with the saw. care he had always brought to them. He hired a general manager who turned out to be excellent, which gave him more room to think about expanding the business in ways he had been considering for a while. He had his eye on a second property 2 streets over that was in the early stages of exactly the kind of trouble his current building had been in when he first walked through it. He made some calls. He asked some questions. He moved slowly and carefully, which was the only speed he had ever trusted for decisions that mattered. He was not in a hurry. He had never been in a hurry. That had been the part of him that people sometimes read as passivity. It was not passivity. It was the particular patience of a man who had learned, at significant personal cost, that the things worth having almost always take longer than you plan for and cost more than you budget and require more of yourself than you expected to give. He had accepted that long ago. The acceptance had not made the cost smaller. But it had made it possible to pay without bitterness. There was one more moment worth telling, which happened about 4 months after the wedding at one of those holiday dinners where the full family had gathered. After the meal, when people were moving between the table and the living room and the conversations had splintered into smaller groups, Gerald found Marcus on the back porch. It was cold. Neither of them had a jacket. Gerald stood next to him and looked at the yard and said without preamble that he had been wrong. He said not just about the money, he said about his assessment. He said that he had looked at Marcus and seen something that was not there and had missed something that was. He said that it was one of the few times in his life he was grateful to have been wrong, because being wrong in that particular way had shown him something he needed to see. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said one thing. He said that the thing about a man who builds quietly is that he is easy to underestimate. He said he had been underestimated so many times in his life that he had long ago stopped being surprised by it. He said that what mattered to him was not being correctly estimated. What mattered to him was building correctly. Estimations were other people's business. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was going to think about that for a while. Marcus said good. Then they went back inside because it was genuinely too cold to stay on the porch, and that was one of those moments where the right ending is simply that two people decide to go back into the warmth. Marcus Reid was not a man who needed the last word. He had never been that man. He was a man who needed the truth and the quiet that comes after the truth, and the knowledge that what he had built with his hands and his years and his stubbornness was still standing at the end of the day. Everything else was just weather. And Marcus Reid had never minded the cold. Marcus Reid spent years being the quiet one in rooms where people assumed quiet meant lesser. He built something real before anyone thought to ask him what he had. And when the moment came to respond to a man who had tried to put a price on his son's most important day, he did not raise his voice. He did not reach for cruelty. He reached for the truth and let it do what truth does when it finally has nowhere left to hide. If you have ever been the person in the room who gets underestimated because you do not announce yourself, or if you have ever spent years building something in silence while people made assumptions about who you were, leave a comment below. Tell Marcus what you would have done in that meeting room. Tell him what your quiet has been building. He wants to know.